I woke up in a hospital room, an IV still in my hand, and my phone kept vibrating. Not messages of concern. Laughter. My son's laughter. His wife's laughter. A video popped up. My wife was standing in a frozen forest, eyes lost, not understanding what was happening. Behind the camera, they turned their backs and walked away, calling it just a joke. I called back. No one answered. That was the moment I understood a bitter truth. While I was lying in a hospital bed fighting to stay alive, my own family was closing the road home for my wife. If you're listening to this story, please tap subscribe so you don't miss real family stories like this one, and leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from. Now, come back with me to the moment when everything began. When the video ended, the hospital room fell so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The doctor said it was only a mild heart attack, that I needed to stay still, needed monitoring. I nodded, but my eyes never left the phone. More voice messages played automatically. Julian's voice again. Lydia's laughter again. They talked to each other the way people do in my kitchen, about something trivial. No one said Catherine's name. No one asked if I was awake. I pulled the blanket higher as if that could block the cold crawling up my back into my neck. Outside the window, the sky darkened fast. I checked the clock. Almost 7 in the evening. In these mountains, when the sun goes down, the temperature follows. I called Julian. Once. Twice. No answer. I sent a message. The mark showed I'd been blocked. I tried Lydia. Same thing. This silence wasn't accidental. It was arranged. I thought back to that morning, before the ambulance took me away. Catherine sat by my bed, holding my hand tight. She kept asking the same familiar question. "You'll come back for me, right?" I nodded. I promised. That promise now hovered somewhere in the hospital room, untouched. A nurse came in and asked if I needed anything. I said no. What I needed was to leave. I needed to go. She looked at me with the eyes of someone used to stubborn patience. She repeated the doctor's orders. I listened, but my mind was already in that frozen forest I'd seen on the screen. I pictured Catherine standing there, hands shaking, trying to remember which way led home. She isn't afraid of the dark. She's afraid of being lost, afraid of not finding her way back. I slowly pulled out the IV, not because it hurt, but because I didn't want attention. I put my coat back on. My shoes were still damp from the morning. When I stood up, the room spun slightly. I leaned against the wall and waited for it to settle. This wasn't the first time I ignored a doctor's advice. I'd done it many times in my life, when I knew my responsibility was somewhere else. The parking lot was nearly empty. I got into the car, closed the door, and sat there for a moment. I breathed steadily, the way I used to before difficult court hearings. I told myself not to rush. But when Catherine's face came into my mind, I couldn't hold back. I started the engine. The headlights cut a long line of light across the damp mountain road. Rain began as I left town. Not heavy, but steady and cold. The wind grew stronger as I climbed higher. Warning signs appeared, then vanished in the light. I drove slower than usual, eyes fixed on both sides of the road. I didn't know exactly where they'd left her. I only knew it was near a familiar edge of forest, a place Julian once called far enough to be quiet. My phone buzzed again. I pulled over. Not Julian. Lydia. A short message. "Don't make this a big deal. It's just a memory test." I read it again and again. The words were dry, empty. That's when I understood something else. They didn't see this as a mistake. They saw it as a beginning. I kept driving. The rain turned into light snow. The road grew slick. I remembered the doctor's words, the nurse's eyes, but I also remembered the way Catherine looks at me, like I'm the last anchor in a world that's drifting away. I couldn't let that anchor slip, not in the middle of a forest. When I turned onto the dirt road leading in, the tires slid slightly. I held the wheel tight. The headlights swept across tall, bare trees. I called her name, even though I knew she couldn't hear me. I called out of habit, to keep myself awake. No answer, only wind, and the crunch of snow under the tires. I stopped at a clearing I recognized from the video. My heart beat faster. I opened the car door. The cold cut into my face. I stood there looking around, searching for something familiar. A scarf, footprints, anything. In that moment, I understood this night wasn't just about finding a path through the woods. It was about facing the truth, that the people I trusted most had chosen to turn their backs and call that choice by a harmless name. I stepped into the forest, one step at a time, calling Catherine's name through my white breath. I didn't know what I would find. I only knew that if I stopped, everything would close in a way I could never accept. I walked a few dozen steps farther, and then I saw her. Catherine was sitting at the base of an old oak tree, her back pressed against the cold trunk. She was holding our old wedding photo frame tight against her chest, the one I thought we had lost years ago. When I called her name, she looked up. Her eyes were empty, but not panicked. She stared at me for a long moment, like she was looking at someone familiar but couldn't quite remember the name. I knelt in front of her and wrapped my coat around her shoulders. Her hands were cold, but they wouldn't let go of the frame. I spoke slowly, one word at a time, the way I've practiced for years. I'm here. We're going home. Catherine didn't answer. She looked at me, then at the dark forest around us. After a moment, she gave a very slight nod, as if nodding to herself. The walk back to the car felt longer than I expected. The snow grew thicker, the wind grew stronger. I carried her when she was tired, then let her walk when she wanted to. I didn't rush. I knew rushing only makes things fall apart faster. When I settled Catherine into the passenger seat, I turned on the heater and waited a few minutes. She rested her forehead against the window, her breathing slowly evening out. I drove home in silence. A heavy silence, but a necessary one. When we arrived, the house lights were all on. I stopped in front of the door. Instinct told me something was wrong. I tried the key. It didn't turn. I tried again. Still, nothing. The lock had been changed. I stood there for a few seconds and heard laughter inside. The clink of glasses. Julian and Lydia. I looked through the window. They were standing in the living room, champagne already open, like they were waiting for good news. I didn't knock. I didn't call their names. I went back to the car. Catherine asked softly, "We're not going in." I told her we'd stay somewhere else for the night. She didn't ask anything more. The trust in her voice cut deep, but I didn't show it. I drove away toward an old cabin that belonged to a friend who had passed. The road was narrow and quiet. I'd been there a few times before, enough to know how to get in and how to stay unnoticed. The cabin wasn't comfortable, but it was warm. I lit the heater, made hot tea, and had Catherine sit near the fire. She watched the flames for a long time, then smiled. A fragile smile, but a real one. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat beside Catherine, listening to her breathing, watching the snow fall outside the window. I thought about what had happened in my house. It wasn't anger that kept me clear-headed. It was clarity. Everything had been prepared in advance. The video, the lock, the message, the silence. This wasn't a careless moment. The next morning, as I arranged Catherine's medication, I noticed something off. The pills didn't look like they usually did. Different color, different smell. I checked the label. Same name as always, but the contents didn't match. I had brought a backup supply. I swapped the pills without saying a word. I needed certainty before drawing conclusions. Over the next 2 days, Catherine became more alert. She asked about the old garden, the apple trees behind the house. She remembered details she'd been forgetting lately. I wrote everything down, quietly. I compared notes. I reread prescriptions. I called our old pharmacist and asked in general terms. The answer was enough for me to understand. There had been a switch. No noise, no obvious trace, but deliberate. I began watching everything from a new distance. I installed a small camera at the cabin entrance. Not to spy, but to record the truth if it came looking. I knew they would come, not out of concern, but because they needed to know where I was and whether I could still respond. That afternoon, Julian's car appeared on the dirt road. I didn't go outside. I let the camera do its work. Julian knocked and called my name in that familiar false tone. Lydia stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes scanning the place. They talked about worry, about misunderstandings, about good intentions. I listened from the kitchen, keeping Catherine in the back room. She was asleep, peaceful. After they left, I reviewed the footage. It was clearer than I expected. Lydia's eyes weren't worried when she looked at the cabin. They were calculating. Julian avoided looking straight at the camera, like he knew he was standing at a line he shouldn't cross. That evening I sat and wrote everything down. No extra emotion, just order. I thought about my years in the courtroom, where truth rarely arrives loudly. It shows up in small details, in consistency. I understood then that the night in the forest wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment everything surfaced. I looked at Catherine asleep, her hand still resting on the wedding photo. I knew that from now on I wasn't only protecting her from fading memory. I was protecting her from a calculated turning away, and I would do it the only way I know how. Calmly, step by step, letting the truth make its own way forward. After Julian and Lydia left the cabin, the air in the forest felt thicker. Not from the cold, but because I knew that, from that moment on, every move we made was under their attention. I was no longer living in reaction. I shifted into preparation. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time in this forest followed its own rules. In the mornings, I lit the fire, boiled water, made tea. Catherine sat by the window watching snow settle on bare branches. She didn't ask why we were here. She only asked small questions. What day is it today? Is it colder than yesterday? Sometimes she called me my love. Sometimes she stayed silent for a long time. I learned to accept both. I began putting everything into a new order. The camera was checked daily. Battery, angle, recording time. I didn't show my caution. If anyone asked, I said I just wanted to keep the cabin safe. But in my mind, each piece was sliding into place. Catherine changed day by day. Not fast, not suddenly, but clearly. She remembered the path down to the creek behind the cabin. She reminded me to cover the small patch of soil by the porch, said winter still needs preparation. I did as she said, even though I'd never done that kind of work before. My hands were stiff, my movements slow. Catherine laughed softly and told me not to rush. That smile took me back to our early years, when we had nothing but time. In the evenings we sat near the fireplace. I read short news pieces to her, passages from an old book she once loved. Sometimes she listened. Sometimes she drifted off to sleep. But there were moments when her eyes lit up. She told me about our wedding, with details so clear I had to pause just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. I didn't speak my thoughts. I simply remembered. Meanwhile, I spent time reviewing old financial documents I had brought along. I used to trust Julian to handle everything properly. I thought it was the best way to ease the burden on Catherine and me. Now I read each number the way one reads a verdict not yet spoken. Small withdrawals. Regular. Labeled with vague reasons. I compared them with bank statements. Some things didn't match. I didn't rush to conclusions. I called the pension fund, asked questions, under the pretense of a routine check. I wrote down the answers. I compared them with what I had. Gradually, a number emerged. It didn't need emphasis. But it couldn't be ignored. $450,000. Not taken all at once. Taken over time. As if someone believed patience would erase every trace. I thought of Julian's eyes in the footage. The way he avoided looking straight ahead. I thought of Lydia. The way she stood slightly forward like someone always ready to step in when others step back. I didn't call to confront them. I didn't send messages. I left everything where it belonged. One afternoon, Catherine asked me, "How long have we been here?" I told her we were resting. She nodded. Then she added very slowly, "Here, I remember more." Her words made me stop what I was doing. I looked at her. She was staring out the window as if no one needed to hear what she'd said. I understood then that the forest's quiet, the sameness of each day, was giving her a safe space. No pressure, no control. That evening, the camera picked up movement again. Not Julian, not Lydia. An old acquaintance from town, stopping by to check in. I knew they had begun asking around. I spoke to him outside, said just enough. I didn't mention Catherine. I didn't mention plans. I kept my tone normal, like a man temporarily away from the city for his health. After he left, I reviewed the footage, the way he glanced inside the cabin, the way he paused when he noticed the camera. I knew attention was spreading. Time was no longer on the side of delay. That night, I sat alone at the wooden table, arranging folders. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel relieved. Only a familiar focus, like the long nights I once spent preparing for difficult trials. I knew what I was doing wasn't revenge. It was closing doors that had been opened the wrong way. Catherine woke up and came out. She sat across from me, looking at the papers. "You're working?" she asked. I nodded. She placed her hand over mine, just for a moment. Said nothing more. That gesture was enough to remind me why I had to see this through. I looked outside, where the snow continued to fall steadily. In that stillness, I understood this period of hiding wasn't escape. It was foundation. What comes next needs this preparation to stand firm. And when the time comes, I won't need to raise my voice. The truth, once placed in the right position, will do the rest on its own. Things began moving faster when Julian sent me an electronic card. No apology, no concern, just a cold announcement. A birthday party to honor and remember Catherine and me. The location was our old house. The time was set precisely, as if everything needed to run on schedule. I read it once and turned off the screen. There was nothing to ask. A celebration without the people being celebrated. A tribute while we were both still breathing. That wasn't confusion. That was confidence. From people who believed the story was already finished. I didn't respond right away. I spent the next few days finishing what was left undone. Files were backed up, footage stored in more than one place. I called an old friend, told him I needed him to be somewhere on a specific evening. No explanation. He agreed. Some people understand each other without details. Catherine heard me mention the party when I reread the card. She asked what kind of party it was. I told her it was a family gathering. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can I wear the blue dress?" I nodded. I didn't know how much she remembered, but I knew she wanted to be there, not to prove anything, just to stand beside me. The day arrived under a pale gray sky. I helped Catherine put on the dress she chose. I straightened her collar, the way I always do when she gets unsure. Before we left the cabin, she looked around once, then held my hand. "We'll come back, right?" I told her. "We'd return to where we belong." She didn't ask more. The house was lit up from a distance. Cars filled the driveway. I recognized a few familiar faces. Old neighbors. Julian's former colleagues. They stood in small groups, talking quietly. When I opened the door and stepped inside, the conversation stopped. No one spoke right away. I heard someone take a sharp breath. Julian stood near the drinks table. The glass in his hand froze midair. Lydia reacted faster. She smiled and stepped forward, like she'd practiced it. "Dad. Mom. I didn't expect this." I nodded. Catherine stood close to me, back straight, calm eyes. The air tightened. Lydia quickly took control. She motioned for the music to lower and spoke about the meaning of tonight, about acceptance, about the limits time places on us. I listened without interrupting. I looked around the room, curiosity mixed with discomfort. They hadn't been told that the main subjects were still very much present. Lydia invited Catherine forward, saying she wanted everyone to better understand Mom's condition. I felt Catherine squeeze my hand. I leaned down and whispered that she only needed to stand still. She nodded. When Lydia placed the microphone in front of Catherine, the room went completely silent. Lydia began speaking, slowly, about moments when Mom no longer recognizes reality, about uncontrolled behavior. She waited for a reaction. Confusion. An empty pause. Catherine looked down at the microphone, then up at the crowd. She stayed silent for a few seconds. I could hear my own heartbeat. "Some people call leaving me in the forest a joke," Catherine said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "Some people say my memory will improve if I find my own way home." The room stirred. Lydia froze. Julian glanced at me, then looked away. Catherine continued. Slowly, as if reading from something memorized long ago. She repeated the words exactly. No added emotion. No embellishment. I saw hands rise to cover mouths. I saw Lydia step back. When Catherine stopped, I stepped forward. I gave a small signal to my old friend. He nodded. The large screen behind the table lit up. The video began. No introduction, no explanation. Just Lydia laughing. Julian beside her. A car door closing. The forest opening ahead. I didn't look at the screen. I watched the crowd. Then came the documents. Not many. Just enough to make it clear this wasn't a twisted story. I didn't use heavy words. I simply said that some things had been hidden, and tonight they were being placed where they belonged. Lydia tried to speak. No sound came out. Julian stood still, his face drained of color. No one interrupted. No one needed to. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. I held Catherine's hand. I felt her slight trembling, but she stood firm. I didn't feel victory. I felt a door opening. quietly, decisively, and I knew that once that door opened, nothing beyond it could ever return to the way it was. After that party, no one tried to stop us. Catherine and I left the house in a heavy but orderly silence. No shouting, no chaos. Only avoided eyes and unfinished sentences swallowed whole. When the door closed behind us, I knew a chapter had ended, even without an official declaration. The next morning I sent Julian and Lydia a complete file. No accusations, no threats, just two options laid out clearly, the way I used to write decisions years ago. Option 1. They sign documents renouncing all rights related to our property, leave the state voluntarily, and close every remaining tie. Option 2. The matter proceeds through the proper process, with everything that has already been documented. I didn't impose a tight deadline. I knew they understood that time was no longer on their side. While waiting, I took Catherine back to the cabin. The forest welcomed us with its familiar stillness. The snow was still there, but the sun appeared more often now. Catherine seemed lighter. She didn't ask about the party. She only asked if I wanted to plant anything that day. I nodded. We did small things, slowly, as if there was nothing else left to resolve. A few days later, the answer arrived. The papers were signed in full. No apology, no explanation, just signatures. I looked at them for a moment, then folded them carefully. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel empty either. Just a sense of things ending where they should. What needed to be closed was closed. I began selling the old house and the remaining assets in the city. The process moved faster than I expected. I kept very little, a few keepsakes, a few books, and the wedding photo frame Catherine still held onto. With what remained, I created a small fund focused on helping elderly people who are mistreated within their own families. I didn't put my name on it in any visible way. I only wanted it to exist and work quietly. Catherine took part in those decisions in her own way. Some days, she remembered clearly offering thoughtful details. Other days, she simply sat beside me and listened. I learned not to demand consistency from her. I only needed her presence. Winter slowly pulled back. Thin sheets of snow melted, revealing damp ground beneath. We spent more time sitting on the cabin porch. I repaired a few old boards. Catherine brought out tea, setting it down carefully. One afternoon, she looked at me for a long time, then called my name without hesitation. Theodore. I turned. She smiled. Just a moment, but enough to stay with me for the rest of my life. I'm not telling this story to seek sympathy. I'm telling it because I once believed family was unbreakable. I was wrong. But I also learned that some things, when they break, open a different path. Quieter. Truer. Now, when night falls and the fire burns steadily, I sit beside Catherine and listen to the wind in the forest. We don't talk much. We don't need to. Peace doesn't come from someone losing. It comes from knowing you chose the right thing to protect. Family to me is no longer a concept based on blood. It's respect. It's care when no one is watching. It's refusing to call turning your back a joke. And sometimes, it's only when everything seems to have closed that we finally find where we truly belong. Thank you for staying until the very end. Sometimes, listening to a story isn't about judging who was right or wrong, but about asking yourself what you would choose when standing at the line between blood and respect. If this story reached you, please subscribe, like, and share, so stories like this can continue to be told, slowly but honestly, to more people. What do you think truly builds a family? Blood, responsibility, or how we treat one another when there's nothing left to gain? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I wish you and the people you love that you always find where you truly belong.